There is a verse hanging on more walls, printed on more t-shirts, and tattooed on more arms than almost any other line in the entire Bible. Athletes quote it before championship games. Entrepreneurs quote it before product launches. People quote it right before a job interview, a surgery, a marathon, a moment when they need to feel unstoppable. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. 4 words in English that sound like a promise of unlimited power. And here is what almost nobody who quotes this verse actually knows. The Greek behind it is not a promise of unlimited power at all. In fact, when you understand what Paul actually wrote, and more importantly, when you understand what he was going through the exact moment he wrote it, the meaning of this verse does not just shift slightly, it nearly reverses. This is not a verse about achievement. It is not a verse about winning. It is a verse written from inside a prison cell, by a man in chains, talking about something almost the opposite of victory. And once you see what the Greek word for strength actually means, and once you see the word Paul chose to describe Christ in this sentence, you will not be able to quote this verse the same way again. Let us start with where you have probably seen this verse used, because the misuse is not an accident. It comes from a real mistranslation of emphasis. Picture the context most people assume. A football player straps on his helmet, looks at the camera, and says the verse as if it means, I am about to dominate this game because Christ is my personal source of unstoppable force. A business owner posts it under a photo of a signed contract as if it means, I closed the deal because divine power flowed through me. A student writes it on an exam booklet as if it means, I will ace this test because nothing is impossible with Christ on my side. All of these uses share one assumption. That panta, the Greek word translated all things, means all things I want to accomplish, all things I set my mind to, all things that count as winning. That assumption is exactly what the original Greek sentence does not support. And to understand why, you have to go back and read the 4 verses just before this one, because Paul tells you directly, in plain language, exactly what he means by all things, and it is almost never what gets printed on the t-shirt. Philippians chapter 4 begins with Paul writing from a Roman prison. He is not free. He is not comfortable. He does not know if he will live or die. And in verse 11 he writes something remarkable. Not that I speak in regard to need, for I have learned in whatsoever state I am, therewith to be content. Content. Not victorious, not dominant. Content. He continues in verse 12. I know both how to be abased, and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I am instructed both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. Read that again, slowly. Paul is not describing a formula for winning. He is describing a skill for enduring both extremes, abundance and hunger, fullness and lack, comfort and suffering. And then, immediately after listing that range of circumstances, he writes the verse everyone knows. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. The word all things in this sentence is not a blank check for any goal a person wants to achieve. It is a direct reference back to the list he just gave. Abasement and abundance, hunger and plenty. All things means all circumstances, not all ambitions. Before we even get to the word translated I can do, there is a word 1 verse earlier that most translations completely bury, and once you see it, you will understand why Paul chose his words so carefully. In verse 11, the word translated content is autarkes, and this is not a word Paul invented for Christian use. Autarkes was a well-known term in Greek philosophy, especially among the Stoics, and it meant self-sufficient. A person who was autarkes needed nothing outside himself. He had trained his mind to be independent of circumstance, independent of possessions, independent of pain and pleasure alike, so that his inner peace came entirely from his own reasoning and his own will. This was considered the highest achievement of Stoic philosophy, a kind of fortress within, a self-generated calm that no external event could penetrate. Paul, writing to a church in Philippi, a Roman colony full of people who would have recognized this exact philosophical vocabulary, deliberately borrows the word, and then he completely relocates its source. Paul does not say I have learned to be autarkes, full stop, meaning he achieved Stoic self-mastery through his own discipline. The very next phrase after using this Stoic term is the sentence about strength coming from Christ. In other words, Paul takes the most famous word in Greco-Roman philosophy for self-sufficiency and quietly redefines it as Christ-sufficiency. He is content, but not because he has trained his own will to be immune to circumstance. He is content because something outside himself, someone outside himself, is continuously sustaining him regardless of the circumstance. This is a direct, pointed contrast with the philosophical culture surrounding him, and it means the verse that follows, "I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me," is not a stray inspirational thought. It is Paul explaining exactly where his so-called self-sufficiency actually comes from, not the self, the sustainer. This detail matters enormously for how the entire passage should be read, because it means Paul is not describing an emotion he talked himself into. He is describing a source he depends on. Every time this verse gets used as a personal empowerment slogan, detached from Christ, functioning almost like a Stoic mantra of self-belief, it accidentally slides back into the very philosophy Paul was correcting. The irony is almost too precise. A verse written specifically to redirect people away from self-generated strength has become, in modern usage, one of the most common slogans for self-generated confidence. Now here is where the Greek changes everything. The phrase translated "I can do" is a single Greek word, ischio. This word does not mean achieve, accomplish, or win. Ischio comes from the root ischis, which refers to strength or ability in the sense of having the capacity to endure or to function, not the power to dominate or conquer. It is closer to the idea of having enough strength to hold up under something, the way a bridge has enough strength to bear weight, rather than the idea of an athlete overpowering an opponent. When Paul says ischio, he is not saying I am empowered to defeat every obstacle in my path. He is saying I have the capacity to remain steady, to keep functioning, to hold together, no matter which extreme I am placed in. This is not a verse about superhuman achievement. It is a verse about supernatural stability. But the word that truly reframes the entire verse is the one describing Christ. In English, it reads through Christ, who strengthens me, as if Christ is simply the battery supplying Paul with extra power on demand. The actual Greek word is endinamounti, a present tense participle of the verb endinamou. This word is built from two parts, the prefix en, meaning in, and the root dynamis, meaning power or inherent ability. This is the same root that gives modern English words like dynamic and dynamite, both describing forceful, explosive potential. But notice the grammar carefully. Endinamuntai is present tense, and it is describing a continuous, ongoing action. Paul is not saying Christ strengthened me once in the past like a single injection of power he received before writing this letter. He is saying Christ is continually, presently, in this very moment, pouring strength into me. It is not a stored reserve Paul draws from occasionally. It is an active, ongoing, empowering relationship happening in real time, verse by verse, day by day, chain link by chain link, in that prison cell. Consider what that continuous strengthening was actually sustaining him through, because it was not a metaphorical hardship. Paul tells us earlier in this same letter in chapter 1 that his chains have become well known throughout the whole Praetorian Guard. Roman imprisonment at this level typically meant Paul was physically chained, often wrist to a rotating series of Roman soldiers day and night, with no privacy, no control over his own movement, and no certainty about the legal outcome awaiting him under the Emperor Nero, a ruler not exactly known for mercy toward those associated with a new and suspicious religious movement. Every soldier who was shackled to him for a shift would have heard him pray, heard him dictate letters, heard him sing. This is the literal, physical scene behind the words, "I can do all things." Not a stage, not a stadium, a chain, a guard, and a cell. When Paul writes ischio, the capacity to hold steady, he is writing it with an actual iron shackle around his wrist. When he writes in dynamounti, the continuous inward strengthening, he is describing the only thing available to him that the chain could not touch. Rome could restrict his body. Rome could not restrict the presence continuously strengthening him from within. This is the paradox almost nobody notices. The verse most often used to declare personal unstoppable power was actually written by a man who had no power over his own circumstances at all. Paul could not walk out of that prison. He could not control whether Rome executed him. He could not choose comfort over suffering. The one thing he could access, in every single moment regardless of his circumstances, was this continuous inward strengthening, not power to change his situation, power to remain steady inside it. The verse is not a claim of control over outcomes. It is a testimony of sustained inner stability, sourced entirely outside himself. This changes the direction of the entire sentence, and the direction is the part almost every modern use of this verse gets backward. Most people read, "I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me," as a statement about their own inner potential, unlocked by faith. Read that way, Christ becomes a resource, almost a tool, something Paul taps into so that he personally can perform. But look again at the grammar. The subject continually receiving the empowering is Paul. The subject continually doing the empowering is Christ, and the verb tense makes clear this is not something that happened once. It is something happening now, in the present, without interruption. The center of the sentence is not Paul succeeding. The center of the sentence is Christ continuously sustaining. Paul is not the hero of this verse. He is the recipient. This pattern is not unique to Philippians. Trace the same root word, dynamis, through the rest of Paul's writing, and the pattern becomes unmistakable. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul begs God 3 times to remove a painful thorn in his flesh, and instead of removing it, God answers, "My strength, dynamis, is made perfect in weakness." Notice the pattern is identical. Strength is not given so a person can escape hardship. Strength is given so a person can endure inside hardship, and God's power is described as being most visible, most complete, precisely inside human weakness rather than human triumph. In Ephesians chapter 3, Paul prays that believers would be strengthened, again from the same root, with power through the Spirit in the inner man, not for outward achievement, but for inward capacity to grasp the depth of love that surpasses knowledge. Every single time Paul uses this family of words, the context is endurance, inward stability, and capacity to remain faithful under pressure, never a formula for winning a competition or closing a business deal. There is one more thread worth pulling before we return to the verse itself, because it shows this was not a one-time turn of phrase Paul reached for under pressure, but a settled theological pattern running through everything he wrote. In 2 Timothy chapter 1, a letter written even later, likely from an even harsher imprisonment, closer to his execution, Paul tells Timothy that God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power, love, and a sound mind. The word translated power there is again dynamis, the same root buried inside in dynamonti in our verse. And notice what dynamis is paired with in that later letter. Not achievement, not victory. Love and a sound mind, stability of character and steadiness of mind, delivered in exactly the same breath as power. This is the consistent Pauline pattern. Whenever this family of Greek words for strength and power appears in his letters, it almost never points toward external accomplishment. It points toward internal steadiness, toward a mind that does not collapse under pressure, toward a character that holds its shape no matter what is happening on the outside. 2 different prisons, 2 different letters, one continuous thread. The strengthening was never about winning. It was about remaining whole. So what does "I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me" actually mean, once the Greek and the context are both restored? It means something far more relevant to real human suffering than most of its popular uses ever imagined. It does not mean Christ will guarantee your victory. It does not mean nothing can stop you. It means that in both abundance and hunger, in both fullness and lack, in both comfort and chains, there exists a continuous, ongoing, present tense strengthening available that does not depend on the circumstance changing at all. Paul was not writing this from a stage after winning. He was writing it from a cell, uncertain if he would ever be free again, and the confidence in his words was not confidence that his situation would improve. It was confidence that whatever the situation became, the inward strengthening would not stop. Here is the paradox that should stop you completely. The verse most often quoted to demand a good outcome was written by a man who had absolutely no idea what his outcome would be. He did not know if he would be released or executed. He tells the Philippians in this exact letter that he is torn between departing to be with Christ, which he calls far better, and remaining in the body, which he calls more necessary for others. This is a man who has made peace with either outcome, and it is precisely because he has released his grip on the outcome that he can say, "In whatever state I am, I have learned to be content, and I can hold steady through all of it, because the strengthening does not come from the circumstance resolving in his favor. It comes from a person, continuously, regardless of how the circumstance resolves." This reframes what it even means to apply this verse to your own life. If you are waiting for this verse to guarantee that the exam goes well, the surgery succeeds, the deal closes, or the game is won, you are applying a promise the original words never made. But if you are asking whether there is a strength available to you in the exact state you are in right now, whether that state is abundance or lack, comfort or crisis, certainty or the complete unknown, then you are standing exactly where Paul stood when he wrote it. The strengthening was never about escaping the chains. It was about remaining whole inside them. Ask yourself honestly, which version of this verse you have actually been living. Have you been treating Christ as a source of power you tap for outcomes you want, a spiritual battery for personal achievement? Or have you been learning the way Paul had to learn in whatsoever state you are, to be content, trusting a strengthening that continues whether the circumstance improves or not? The Greek makes it almost impossible to read this verse as a formula for winning. It reads instead as a testimony from a man in chains who discovered that the one thing chains cannot touch is a continuous inward strengthening flowing from outside himself, present tense without interruption, regardless of what happens next. This is why the verse belongs on the wall of a hospital room as much as it belongs in a locker room. It belongs in a hospital room more than a locker room if we are honest about the Greek. Because the verse was never a promise that you will do great things. It was a testimony that you can remain steady through anything, not because your circumstances will change, but because of who continues to strengthen you inside them. The word is ischio, the capacity to hold steady. The word is endinamonti, the one continuously pouring in strength. Present tense, ongoing, without pause, not a single burst of power in the past, a continuous relationship in the present. Think back to the last time you quoted this verse, or heard someone else quote it. Right before a job interview, a game, a difficult conversation, a medical result. What were you actually hoping the verse would deliver in that moment? Were you hoping for a guaranteed outcome? A win dressed up as faith? A Stoic-style declaration of confidence borrowed from the very philosophy Paul was quietly correcting? Or were you actually prepared the way Paul was prepared to hold steady no matter which way the outcome went? Trusting a strengthening that continues whether you get the job, win the game, or receive the result you were hoping for. There is a real difference between asking Christ to change your circumstance and asking Christ to sustain you inside whatever circumstance remains. Paul never got out of that first imprisonment the way he might have wanted, and by the time of his final imprisonment described in 2 Timothy, he was fully aware that this one likely ended in his execution. And yet the same word, dynamis, the same continuous strengthening, is present in that final letter too, right up until the end. If the verse only worked when circumstances improved, Paul would have stopped using this language the moment his own outcome turned fatal. He did not stop, which means the strengthening was never contingent on the ending being happy. Ask yourself honestly which version of this verse you have actually been living. Have you been treating Christ as a source of power you tap for outcomes you want? A spiritual battery reserved for personal achievement, quietly borrowing the confidence of ancient Stoic self-sufficiency and simply relabeling it with his name? Or have you been learning, the way Paul had to learn, in whatsoever state you are, to be content, trusting a strengthening that continues whether the circumstance improves or not, whether the chain comes off or stays on, whether the verdict favors you or does not? The Greek makes it almost impossible to read this verse as a formula for winning. It reads instead as a testimony from a man in chains who discovered that the one thing chains cannot touch is a continuous inward strengthening flowing from outside himself, present tense, without interruption, regardless of what happens next. This is why the verse belongs on the wall of a hospital room every bit as much as it belongs in a locker room. And if we are honest about the Greek, it belongs there even more, because the verse was never a promise that you will do great and impressive things. It was a testimony that you can remain whole through anything, not because your circumstances are guaranteed to change, but because of who continues to strengthen you inside them, hour by hour, chain link by chain link, regardless of the verdict still waiting to be handed down. The word is issue, the capacity to hold steady rather than the power to conquer. The word is endynamouti, the one continuously pouring in strength, present tense, ongoing without pause. Not a single burst of power delivered once in the past, but a continuous relationship sustained in the present, the same present tense stretching from a Roman cell 2,000 years ago into whatever room you are sitting in right now. If this changed the way you will ever read this verse again, if I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me no longer sounds like a promise of victory, but instead sounds like a testimony of steadiness inside chains, share this with someone who needs to hear it the way Paul actually meant it. Not a formula for winning, a testimony for enduring. Abundance or hunger, fullness or lack, comfort or chains, the strengthening never stops, because it was never about the circumstance changing at all. It was about who never stops holding you steady inside it.